In contrast, the Habsburg dynasty clung to its imperial legacy through the Austrian crown, which transformed into a multi-ethnic entity comprising Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slavs, and others. However, it experienced a bitter internal struggle among its ethnic components. Vienna remained for many years the capital of an empire trying to appear as the heir to the Holy Roman Empire, but without its ecclesiastical or universal character. By the turn of the 20th century, this attempt was also eroding until it finally collapsed after World War I, ending the last dynasty that ruled in the name of that ancient memory. As for the European consciousness, the Holy Roman Empire remained a unique example of an unprecedented form of governance. It combined Latin and Germanic elements, religion and state, the symbolism of Rome, and the pragmatism of the Middle Ages. It was an ambiguous experiment, difficult to classify precisely, as it was neither a nation-state, nor a colonial empire, nor an absolute monarchy, but a hybrid entity that lived by balances and collapsed when this balance was disturbed. Perhaps for this very reason, it has remained a subject of study and reflection for historians, not only as a political experiment, but also as a mirror of European history in its longest struggles between unity and diversity, center and periphery, idea and possibility. Thus, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire was not just an end, but the beginning of a new era, and new questions about the form of power, the meaning of belonging, and the role of history in shaping the present. It was the end of an empire, but it was not the end of the idea. Thanks for watching. When the page of the Holy Roman Empire was turned, Europe was not as it had been before. The continent entered a new era, not based on inherited structures and religious symbolism, but on the rise of nation-states, the consecration of national sovereignty, and the emergence of the idea of the people as a political actor. The departure of the empire was not just a political vacuum in Germany or the loss of a position in Vienna, but a change in the way governance, authority, and belonging were understood deep within the continent. With its departure, Europe lost the last living manifestation of the concept of a Christian empire, an idea that since the Middle Ages had sought to unite Western Europe under one banner in the name of religion and Roman legitimacy. But as much as the empire ended politically, it remained alive in historical memory and in the struggles of the peoples who had developed within its old framework. In the German lands, a longing for unity persisted, not out of loyalty to the bygone emperor, but as a result of the sense of powerlessness left by the absence of a unifying entity. The small, fragmented states felt weak against the major surrounding powers, France to the west, Russia to the east, and Austria and Prussia from within. Although Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine provided a kind of temporary organization, a general feeling began to grow that Germany needed a real, unified, sovereign state. Thus, the end of the empire sowed the seeds of the German national project, which would later mature under Prussian leadership and lead to the unification of Germany in 1871. However, this unification was not a restoration of the Holy Roman Empire, but its antithesis, a centralized, militaristic state based on the idea of the nation, not religion, and on the sword, not the sacred crown. In the summer of 1806, Emperor Francis II found himself cornered by history. He was the heir to a majestic crown that carried echoes of ancient Rome and the Carolingian legacy, but in reality, he had become an emperor without an empire. He had witnessed with his own eyes how the German states unraveled one after another, and how most of them aligned under Napoleon's banner, not just due to conquest, but also out of weariness with an entity that had become more of a symbolic burden than an actual shield. Francis was no stranger to the corridors of politics. He belonged to the venerable Habsburg dynasty, and knew that a crown is preserved not by wishes, but by foresight and flexibility. Perhaps his realization of this reality is what led him to make a preemptive decision before the crown was forcibly removed from his head. On August 2, 1806, Francis took the decisive step. he formally announced his abdication of the title of Holy Roman Emperor and informed the European states that the empire, which had long been a stage for rituals, contracts, and alliances, had ended. This announcement was not the result of a humiliating treaty, as happened later in other wars, but a unilateral decision he made out of the conviction that continuing to hold the title was merely clinging to a mirage. Although the abdication was met with relative calm, its repercussions were profound. It turned a page on centuries of imperial history and formally declared that the old order had breathed its last in the heart of Europe. Francis was not a traitor to the legacy, but a realist in the face of necessity. He chose to save what could be saved of his dynasty's influence rather than burn its last cards in a losing battle against Napoleon. He thus became a model of a ruler who chose to abandon symbolic glory for political survival. At that moment, there was no funeral procession for the Holy Roman Empire, nor an official eulogy befitting its ancient dignity, but only a legal and formal silence that announced the end of the longest-lasting empire Europe had known since Rome. Amidst this chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged, a young general whose star shone in military campaigns in Italy and Egypt, then leaped to power after the coup of November 1799. With his assumption of rule in France, a new chapter of confrontation with the traditional European order began. Napoleon was not just a military leader, he was a political engineer who understood that redrawing the map of Europe required eliminating outdated structures that hindered the unity of peoples and the centralization of states, chief among them, naturally, the Holy Roman Empire. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in a symbolic act that challenged the Pope's authority and declared himself master of the new order. Napoleon did not stop at this coronation. He immediately began dismantling the old structure of Central Europe. He waged successive campaigns against Austria, Prussia, and Russia, winning decisive battles like Austerlitz in 1805, which humiliated the Austro-Russian coalition and exposed the fragility of the Holy Roman Empire as a military force. In the aftermath of these victories, Napoleon began imposing his terms on the German states, pushing them to withdraw from the empire's entity and join his new political project, the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, bringing together 16 German states, a number that later expanded. This confederation was akin to an organization subordinate to France, ruled by local princes under the umbrella of French protection. With this move, Napoleon struck at the heart of the empire, depriving it of its most important states and practically declaring its end as an effective entity. The emperor's authority no longer extended to those regions, and no one in Europe treated the Holy Roman Empire as a living entity anymore. This accelerating erosion was embarrassing and painful for Francis II, Emperor of Austria and holder of the title of Holy Roman Empire. The man who was supposed to be the guardian of Christian unity in Central Europe found himself powerless to protect even the states that bore his name. The fall of the empire was not the result of a single blow, but a series of transformations that made its existence impossible in a new world being forged by Napoleon with force and cunning. Hence, it seemed the moment of decision was approaching, and the emperor had no choice but to bow to the storm. At the end of the 18th century, Europe stood on the cusp of an unprecedented transformation, unlike the political changes the continent had grown accustomed to over centuries. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, was like an explosion deep within the old structure of the European order, an order that had long rested on the legitimacy of monarchs, the church, and the nobility. The revolution came to turn it upside down. The French Revolution was not merely an internal struggle between monarchy and the people. It was the birth of a new world based on concepts unfamiliar to the continent: citizenship, republicanism, equality before the law, and the right of peoples to self-determination. European peoples embraced these ideas with passion, but they terrified the ruling elites, especially in countries like Austria, which saw the revolution as an existential threat to hereditary systems of government. Faced with this revolutionary tide, the major European powers sought to contain it and overthrow the nascent French Republic. Thus began a series of revolutionary wars that swept across Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire found itself an unprepared party to the confrontation. Despite Austria's attempts as the most powerful component of the empire to resist the revolutionary tide, internal fragmentation within the empire's territories weakened its ability to wage a prolonged conflict. The German states were not prepared to fight in defense of an imperial idea that no longer had a real presence in their daily lives. Many of them, in fact, approached the new reality with a mixture of anticipation and opportunism. Since the Middle Ages, the gulf between the imperial crown and its subordinate states began to widen. Powerful entities emerged, asserting their influence at the expense of the emperor's authority, most notably Austria, Bavaria, Bohemia, and later Prussia. As for the free imperial cities, they grew economically and socially, but saw the emperor as little more than a distant symbol who did not interfere in their actual affairs. The crisis of the center worsened with serious religious and political developments in the 16th and 17th centuries. With the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, the empire became religiously divided between Catholics and Protestants, and religion became a factor of disunity rather than cohesion. The 30 Years' War, essentially a religious and political conflict within the empire, devastated vast swaths of its lands and clearly exposed the fragility of its structure. When that war ended with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, the empire was never the same. The peace granted the princes of the states sovereign powers in all matters concerning foreign policy, the military, and taxation, meaning their authority, in reality, surpassed that of the emperor himself. The emperor at that time was closer to an honorary head, formally presiding over an entity without effective leadership. No unified army, no unified taxes, not even a common foreign policy. The empire was no longer a center for determining the fate of Central Europe, but more like a negotiating platform for the real players: Austria, Prussia, France, and England. Even within German lands, the imperial identity no longer meant much. Regional and national identities began to replace it. In this context, the Holy Roman Empire was slowly eroding from within. It didn't collapse suddenly, but rather wore away over centuries. It didn't fall in a decisive foreign war, but gradually withered due to its internal contradictions and its inability to adapt to the modern era. Thus, when the winds of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars blew, they didn't find a solid entity standing in their way, but a fragile structure awaiting its official moment of collapse. From the moment Otto I was crowned emperor by Pope John XII in 962 AD, the nucleus of the Holy Roman Empire was formed, an attempt to revive the glory of the Western Roman Empire, which had collapsed centuries earlier. However, this imperial fledgling was not a unified or centralized entity in the political sense. Rather, it was more like a sprawling network of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, and bishoprics, loosely bound by religious and political ties under the emperor's banner. Over time, instead of this network consolidating and transforming into a solid state, fragmentation increased, and the gaps between the center and its peripheries deepened. The emperor held a grand title, but often lacked direct authority over most of his empire's territories. This structural weakness was no accident, but the product of centuries of feudal traditions, geographical obstacles, and the conflicting interests of local princes. Each regional ruler within the empire possessed a significant degree of political and military autonomy, and in many cases was viewed as a king within his own small kingdom. Although the emperor was elected by the 7 electors, these elections were subject to political blackmail and complex balances of power among major families like the Habsburgs, Wittelsbachs, and Luxembourgs. Although the emperor was elected by the 7 electors, these elections were subject to political blackmail and complex balances of power among major families like the Habsburgs, Wittelsbachs, and Luxembourgs. In the summer of 1806, a flame was extinguished. that of one of the longest-lived political entities in European history, the Holy Roman Empire. This empire had stood since the coronation of Otto I in 962 AD, a sprawling framework encompassing hundreds of disparate principalities, cities, and duchies nestled in the heart of Europe. But this entity, long a subject of debate between those who saw it as a shield of Christian unity and those who considered it merely a legal fiction, officially came to an end on August 2nd at the hands of its last emperor, Francis II. So, what led to the collapse of this ancient entity? What circumstances pushed Francis II to relinquish the crown? And how was this event received in a Europe already ablaze with the fires of revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars? But before we dive in, we'd like to remind you that over 80% of our valued viewers aren't subscribed to the channel. So if you're a fan of history and the allure of grand events, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss out on our latest content.